So, I'm finally reviewing Dr. Zhivago. I'm gonna go full spoilers if there's lots of non-spoiler Zhivago stuff out there, so you're warned. Dr. Zhivago. I had a really good time reading this book, but to review it, we have to get the obvious out of the way first. Is it a great love story? If you saw the movie, or if you've been tempted to buy it, you might have noticed that it often is billed as such. On mine, it even says one of the greatest love stories ever told, but I think that's a tad misleading. In fact, someone coming in for a love story might find the book a bit of a disappointment. I would even argue the tag wound up there because the publishers weren't really sure how else to pitch this, but I'll come back to that later. I feel that a better description of Dr. Zhivago would be as a thematic sequel to War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. The characters are even reading War and Peace at least once or twice in the book, and the Tolstoyan movement is also mentioned several times. I didn't even know there was a Tolstoyan movement. That was quite interesting for me. The philosophy expounded on by Tolstoy in War and Peace, that great men and leaders don't in fact write history, that they're just the wave pushed by the boat, is expounded on and expanded on by Pasternak, who added a lot of his own insight. Tolstoy thought of it just this way, but did not say it in so many words. While denying that history was set in motion by Napoleon or any other ruler or general, he did not carry his reasoning to its conclusion. History is not made by anyone. You cannot make history, nor can you see history, any more than you can watch the grass growing. Wars and revolutions, kings and Robespierres are history's organic agents, its yeast. But revolutions are made by fanatical men of action with one-track minds, men who are narrow-minded to the point of genius. They overturn the old order in a few hours or days. The whole upheaval takes a few weeks or at most years, but for decades thereafter, for centuries, the spirit of narrowness which led to the upheaval is worshipped as holy. Major themes in both of Tolstoy's most famous works, War and Peace and Anna Karenina, was this search for fulfillment in his principal characters like Pierre, Andrei, Anna, and Levin. And Yuri Zhivago, though he doesn't have those same doubts and questions about existence as Tolstoy's heroes did, Yuri Zhivago does have the same appreciation for simplicity that they were searching for. And the larger events of the story, they just annoy and bewilder him. He's the sort of person who would help an injured man lying in the street when the average person in that time were the brigands who robbed him. In a way, Yuri's kind of starting the story with an outlook that characters in a Tolstoy novel have to find. Levin spends most of Anna Karenina looking for a meaning to life, and he can't really find it, but he finds it at the end. Yuri is someone who's already kind of there, and considering he's a fan of Tolstoy, I guess that makes a lot of sense. But then the world around him is kind of frustrating his ideals because they don't seem to make any sense in this world. He's this very sensitive guy, and everything around him is falling apart. The question of the worth of the lower classes. This is a very structured society that Russia was in at the beginning of the 20th century when the book begins. And what rights the lower classes have, or how responsible wealthy people are for them, those were big subplots of War and Peace and Anna Karenina. And it's also the crux of Dr. Zhivago as well. I mean, the book is set in a time of great, let's just say it's a time of great change in Russia. And the book really focuses, it zooms in on those ideas and shows how they changed the long-established order of Russia and wreaked havoc on society, basically. So the first half of the story largely establishes this world. Maybe some of his younger readers wouldn't have been familiar with it, and I guess he wants to really illustrate every point. And in his older readers, I guess that would have brought out some nostalgia for those days, the end of the 19th century before the First World War, the Great War. But the second half of the novel feels downright post-apocalyptic. I mean, it even features wasteland survivor Strelnikov shooting it out with wolves. So, not really a simple love story. There's a ton of stuff here to unpack, and I think if you came in only for a love story, a lot of this it would not be fun at all. There are also a ton of characters in this book, and if I tried to talk about all of them, this essay would get hours long, and I mean, we're in the era of short content on YouTube for some reason. Fundamentally, I found each character interesting, for different reasons. And some of the most memorable characters were only there for a short time. For instance, in part 7, when Yuri, he's traveling and he gets off the train, there are these 3 guards that take him to see Strelnikov. And one of them, he never holds his rifle correctly. He's either carrying it wrong, or I think he's dragging it through the dirt a couple of times. And it's that kind of little detail that makes a character just stick in my head. Because I've seen the movie a lot of times, I already knew a lot of the basics of the story. I knew about the relationship with Laura and Komarovsky, but I wasn't ready for just how damaged she is in the novel. The lengths Pasternak took with describing her situation, he really dwells on where she is at the beginning of the story. It established that we're not going to be dealing with a particularly stable character, so I was able to look at her actions through that lens. At the same time, he didn't give so many details that I felt like he was reveling in the situation. It does feel like he's condemning it, but he needs to make it clear. What really fascinated me here, though, is that Pasternak didn't just say, "Oh, the poor dear," and leave it at that. He went right into her mind and shows how her view on her own situation, because she's very young at the start of the story, so she's not a fully formed personality. So sometimes she seems to be enjoying Komarovsky's attention. And other times she'll have a very introspective moment and realize just how dysfunctional her situation is. And much later, she's better at understanding it herself, but her relationships with men are kind of permanently confused because of this early trauma that she went through. And she remains highly vulnerable to Komarovsky later in life, which it just made a lot of sense from how he described it. And it's not easy to have damaged characters for point-of-view characters, and I was very impressed with how he pulled that off. Now, whenever I watched the movie, I always noticed how Pasha, or Strelnikov, he just kind of disappears partway through, and we never hear about him again. Well, we do hear about him later, that he's dead, but we don't see him again. And I was so happy when I was reading the novel and I saw that there was lots of him, because it always felt like there was something kind of missing with him in the film. He was such a well-developed character that he almost felt like he really felt like a protagonist, one of the protagonists of the story, even though there were long sections where he was absent. I could easily have imagined the whole book being from his perspective, because he had all this stuff happen to him, and a lot of it he only describes whenever we catch up with him, especially near the end. He's almost like the tragic hero of the story. It's like I saw him as a deconstruction of the sort of the heroic rebel character fighting for a better future. But instead of saving his country, he just falls on his sword trying. And I could imagine another version of this where he's the main character, and there'd be a lot more action, and after fighting his way across the apocalyptic landscape of Russia, he winds up meeting his wife's lover, and just sees himself in contrast, like how different they are. That Yuri, with his lofty ideals, but at the same time his lack of, his lack of action. It's a sharp contrast to where Strelnikov's journey took him. And then he kills himself to avoid the shame of capture and execution. It's all, it was very deconstructive, and I really enjoyed it. More on that contrast of Yuri and Pasha, because these are both the men who loved Laura, so there has to be similarities between them for it to make sense that she would be attracted to both of them. And there are similarities. They both have these big ideas, but they manifest in very different ways, because they're both... Yuri and Pasha Strelnikov are both approaching life through slightly different lenses. So while Pasha is governed by politics and rational thinking, Yuri is governed by a lot of idealism and this sort of goodwill, which he expresses in his poetry. And whenever politics come up in the story, they tend to derail Yuri's life. And it's when he's left to his own devices, when he's left alone, that's when he finds most of his happiness, such as at Verikino, first with Tonya and later with Laura. Zhivago's flaw is also that he's a dreamer, which I like. His strength is that he's a dreamer. He's kind of safe inside his mind, but it's also a weakness because the body cannot live without the mind. But the mind can't live without the body either. And this is something that is discussed at length in the story. Although I think Tonya was wrong when she said that he has no will. I mean, I think only will could have gotten Zhivago through all of his trials, especially when he escapes from the partisans and gets all the way back to Yuriatin on foot mostly, as I recall, during the Russian winter. But this bit of misjudgment from Tony, at least I saw it as misjudgment. I think that was just Pasternak again being clever and showing how Tonya doesn't understand Yuri to the same level that Laura can. Maybe she's not damaged enough. Adultery is a big thing in this book, which is another reason why it doesn't really feel like a true romance to me. But considering that Pasternak himself had a longtime mistress, I think adultery shouldn't be that surprising to find in this story. But I found myself sympathizing with the characters in spite of these shortcomings. I don't feel like the book painted a rosy picture of the characters' actions, but given the horrible circumstances that Yuri so often finds himself in, I could really find his moral lapses surprisingly human and even forgivable. And also just, he's such an unfortunate protagonist. His pangs of conscience and just his general lack of luck just made me feel sorry for him, and his little bits of happiness were kind of nice to see. And, I mean, these characters weren't even fortunate before the revolution began. Zhivago lost his mother and his father at a young age, and that's what makes him retreat into this world of poetry and idealism and whatnot, and gives him this difficulty in relating to people, because he's always been alone. He didn't develop tools to relate to others. And then also losing his mother, maybe he's trying to find her, and so his relationship to women is very confused, in the same way that Laura's situation causes her to have confused relation to men. So it really made sense that there's a bond between these damaged people. And some of the moments late in the story when Laura and Yuri were together at Verikino, they made me happy to see, because there was just so much brutality going on. And it was a heartwarming break from all the horrors. And I feel like it puts the reader in Zhivago's place, that you go through all this horrible stuff, and then you have a chance at just having something happy. So I found myself snatching at it, the same way that he did. But even though the happiest moments in the book come out of the love these characters have, I would still seriously question calling this a love story. For me, it's an epic with a love story inside of it, because there's so much more going on. It's like saying The Lord of the Rings is only an adventure. The adventure is the thing that's driving it, but there's a lot more to find.
Mr. Twunker, some people can read War and Peace and come away thinking it's a simple adventure story. Others can read the ingredients on a chewing gum wrapper and unlock the secrets of the universe.
Lex, what has chewing gum got to do with the secrets of the universe?
Mm-hmm. Right, Miss Desmond.
One of the cornerstones of this book is how it discusses the 19th and 20th centuries and how it is so critical of communism, which is why it couldn't be published in Russia during Pasternak's lifetime, and why the CIA apparently took a big interest in getting it published elsewhere. The way Pasternak describes the privations and lack of order in that time is very thought-provoking. He depicts complete economic shutdown. Everyone is just bartering in this story. I seem to recall parts where they're like breaking down furniture and selling the wood and stuff like this for firewood, which is very crazy, but it's discussed. It's all shown as hypocrisy because the the revolutionaries are claiming that they want to build a better world, and yet everything is just getting worse. Early on, Zhivago, he sees the benefit of these changes, but as the novel goes on, characters are less free to express themselves. Early in the book, you have characters discussing religious ideas, but the more that it progresses, they're less free to have these discussions. And this, too, also drives Yuri away from people, because it's very frustrating to him that, especially in the section of the book where he's with the partisans, that they can't see the hypocrisy of what they're fighting for. They're saying they want to make things better, and they're actively making things worse, as far as he can see it. Part of why I think this book would have been banned is because it doesn't play any favorites amongst the factions fighting over Russia. They're all portrayed as very brutal. Barbarism is the way. And this is a far cry from a generally favorable depiction of the White Russian faction, which you see today because communism, of course, got overthrown, so the people that were against them have been sort of held up, perhaps on an unearned pedestal, but Boris Pasternak certainly didn't seem to see it that way. There is something in this book that I've seen in other works from the early to mid-20th century, basically before World War II. Following the great changes in the world after the First World War, like the dissolution of entire kingdoms that had lasted for centuries, there's, in a lot of these early to mid-20th century works, there's a sort of longing, a sort of nostalgia for the last decades of the 19th century. It's present in things like Gladiator or movies like Alexander's Ragtime Band, for instance. Bonus points if you've seen that, by the way. But I would say it's prevalent in Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was also of that generation that he saw this change, a more industrialized world, a world very different from the one he had grown up in. And he seems to be critical of that, but also accepts that it has to be that way. But while many books or films are simply about one era or the other, they're either about the 19th century and there's nostalgia for it, or they're about the 20th century, but there's this lingering feeling of nostalgia. Dr. Zhivago is about those changes. These changes are the focus of the story. And the change from the staid, settled times at the beginning to the chaos of that led to the then modern world of communism in Russia, which is, of course, the era Pasternak himself lived through. And people like Laura and Zhivago, they were amongst those who couldn't adjust to the change, and they simply didn't make it. In the later part of the book, when Pasha and Yuri meet each other, Pasternak uses Strelnikov, Pasha, to sort of expound some thoughts about the end of the 19th century and how things have changed. Of course, it's through Strelnikov's point of view, so probably not 100% what Pasternak was feeling. None of this can mean anything to you. You couldn't understand it. You grew up quite differently. There was the world of the suburbs, of the railways, of the slums and tenements, dirt, hunger, overcrowding, the degradation of the worker as a human being, the degradation of women, and there was the world of the mother's darlings, of smart students and rich merchants' sons, the world of impunity, of brazen, insolent vice, of rich men laughing or shrugging off the tears of the poor, the robbed, the insulted, the seduced. The reign of parasites, whose only distinction was that they never troubled themselves about anything, never gave anything to the world, and left nothing behind them. Of course, it wasn't only in Moscow or in Russia that there existed these Tverskaya Yamskaya streets, with young rakes in fancy hats and spats rushing about with their hired girls and their hired carriages. That street, that nightlife of the street, the nightlife of the past century, and the racehorses and the rakes existed in every city in the world. Just the way he describes that, with this sort of feeling that it'll never come back again, that gives some insight, I think, into just how big these changes were. And in a Tolstoy novel, or even a British classic like David Copperfield or Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, characters have lots of time to sort out the meaning of their lives, but the characters in Dr. Zhivago don't have that convenience. There's all this time pressure, and they have to adapt or die out. And rather than Dr. Zhivago being able to live his life and come to some kind of new understanding of himself, well, that's just not how this book works. And I think it really gets across. He's driving home the idea of how things are different now. Before, there would have been time for that, and now there just isn't. Perhaps just how dark Dr. Zhivago can be is best encapsulated by, at the end, there are these two side characters, Gordon and Durdarov, and they're talking about how maybe the best thing that happened was Nazis invading, was the German invasion of Russia, because it forced everyone to unify and get out of this self-destructive bubble that they were in. But yeah, you gotta know it's a dark story when World War II is the best thing that happened to you. I'd like to touch on technique, on prose, but it's a bit hard because everything is translated. I think overall structure still comes through a translation, and it's definitely a well-told story. Pasternak frequently put the most exciting content in a chapter at the very end, and then he'll spend the next chapter dealing with that, and at the end he gives you something else exciting. It's basically using cliffhangers, which I didn't really expect to find it in something that we consider a classic. Cliffhangers are the sort of things that I think of in TV shows, but it has given me a greater insight into noticing that cliffhangers basically exist in things where we don't expect it. In these old stories that had to, in their time, they did have to compete for people's attention, whereas today they're kind of grandfathered in. Also, his style ranges from having incredible clarity. A lot of the time, everything feels very grounded, but at other times he moves into this sort of dreamlike state where things feel more sort of abstract, and it gives him a lot of wiggle room for how he wants to describe a scene. Sometimes it feels like you're getting the bare bones. He's just laying it down, and that makes it feel very vivid. Other times he can take advantage of a dream state to make things more horrific or more beautiful or whatever desired effect he's going for, and I definitely appreciated that. I know that Pasternak was criticized for his use of coincidence, but as far as I'm concerned, I was always very excited by what I was reading, so maybe there's a lot of coincidence, but I forgive it. I feel like it works. The poems. Pasternak included at the back of the book, there's a whole section of poetry that is meant to be written by the main character, by Yuri Zhivago. And I wasn't sure how enjoyable they would be for me, so what I did was I would just read one or two poems at the end of each reading session, so I broke them up. And even though I was enjoying them, I wasn't sure how necessary they were. But as I got closer to the end, I found myself rereading them, especially ones that were mentioned by name, so I could get I found it increased my immersion to see where he is in the story when he's writing, and then see what he wrote. Of course, Pasternak wrote everything, but to then read the characters' feelings coming through in his own poetry, for me it just added to the immersion of the story. Of course, there is the famous 1965 film adaptation. I've seen it many times. I've always really enjoyed it. And I thought about touching on it in a big way in the video, but I don't feel like there's much point. It's like a lot of adaptations. It's different enough that you could pretty much see it as its own thing. I would say that most obviously, the film is a lot less violent. I would say it's probably more romantic, which likely led to the tagline being added onto the book, that it's one of the greatest love stories ever told, because they want to draw in the crowd that mostly know the film, and fair, business and all that. If you just want to compare the difference, I'd say just look at how Yuri dies in the book compared to how he dies in the movie. His death in the book is incredibly pathetic, but in the movie it is too, but he still dies in a romantic situation. He thinks he sees his love and he gets out of the tram to try and catch her. But in the book, he just kind of has a heart attack and dies. It's just sad. I also felt like the film was kind of concerned with setting things right, whereas the book tended to just let sadness play out. It likely just reflects a cultural difference between the East and the West. There is sort of this thing that Russian writers are famous for being a little on the bleak side, and it's not exactly undeserved. Not that I mind. It depends what you're in the mood for. So, the film's a masterpiece in its own right. I don't even feel like getting concerned about comparison is particularly important. And my god, the music, but I'm not going to play any of it here. Go listen to it on YouTube or something. To summarize, I think Dr. Zhivago is definitely an important novel. Pasternak was saying a lot of stuff that was very much not okay to say in Russia when he was writing. Today, the book, as I understand it, is required reading in a lot of Russian schools. Whether you enjoy it, of course, is going to be subjective. But I think it became one of my favorite books while I was reading it, just because of its depth, its imagination, the grittiness. I always like when things are, if you're going to tell a brutal story, might as well go all the way with it, and there was some really brutal stuff in this book. And it was very readable once I settled into the pace, and translations are always difficult, I think, especially Russian. It's hard for it not to become clunky. But once I got into the pace of how it's written, I found it very readable and I really enjoyed it. And this has been my best attempt at explaining what I think it means and all that. But as always, this is all just my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments. Send me a friend request on Goodreads if you feel like it. I generally post spoiler-free reviews of what I'm reading on there. Let me know what you're reading at present, and I'll see you next time.